Why Philosophical Discussions About Everyday Life is produced by the Institute for Philosophy and Public Life, a division of the University of North Dakota's College of Arts and Sciences. Visit us online at whyradioshow.org.
Hi, I'm Jack Russell Weinstein, host of Why, Philosophical Discussions About Everyday Life. Today we welcome our guest Adrian Bardon for a conversation I'm calling Why Do We Deny Such Obvious Things? This is going to be a little abstract for a while, so bear with me because I'd like to begin with a very old debate in philosophy, starting with Descartes' famous observation that we can never be certain if we are awake or asleep. This is what inspired The Matrix, Inception, The Wizard of Oz, and Fight Club. It seems impossible for us to tell the difference between reality and a dream. Philosophers struggle with this. Can we be certain of anything? What does it mean to know? If our experience is all so unreliable, might the universe just be in our heads? Several centuries after Descartes, George Berkeley argued just this and claimed that matter itself doesn't even exist. He tried to prove that there is no physical world, that reality is entirely mental. And this upset Samuel Johnson so much, he's the guy who wrote the first dictionary, that Johnson kicked a big rock in front of his friends and shouted, "I refute it thus." What Johnson was suggesting is that common sense tells us what we need to know about the world. Matter's existence should be as obvious as the pain we get from kicking a rock. The first thing I want all of us to ask then is whether this works. Can calling attention to an obvious truth ever really persuade people who deny it? Are facts that powerful? Now back to our story. 2 centuries later, G.E. Moore would take another swing at defending reality by calling attention to his own hands. He held up his right one and said, "Here is one hand," then raised the left and said, "Here is another." Since he knew those hands existed, he argued, he knew that the rest of the world did too. Obviously, this doesn't solve the problem either, but it inspired Wittgenstein to challenge the debate itself, and this is one of my all-time favorite philosophical claims. The whole controversy was meaningless, he argued, because if those were not actually Moore's hands, then we might as well be living on the moon. Wittgenstein pointed out that the terms Moore relied upon to defend existence, words like knowledge and certainty, could only be used in accordance with certain pre-established rules. Language is like a game, he argued. If you cheat, you're not really playing the game anymore. For Moore to claim he knew his hands existed was to change the meaning of the word knowledge to such an extent that he might as well have been speaking a different language or playing a different game. If it turns out that our hands don't exist, then why would we believe our houses do? If our houses are illusions, then our children are too. Can we even believe we live where we do when we might be on the moon instead? In other words, and here's what I've been preparing to tell you, asking about our knowledge of one thing is to ask about our knowledge of everything. Let me put this yet another way. When my students and I talk about political equality and the question of proof comes up, I always respond by telling them this. All I can say is that if it turns out that all people aren't of fundamentally equal worth, then pretty much everything I believe about the world is wrong. I got nothing. You see, it all hangs together. The conviction that all people are equal is not a single belief to prove or disprove. It's my stance in the world. All of this has been a circuitous way to prepare us for today's discussion about denialism. Our guest will help us explore philosophically why some people reject the science of climate change or the efficacy of vaccines. He'll explain how some politicians can look at data disproving their economic policies, but argue for them anyway. He'll inspire us to consider what the difference is between identifying with a religion and with a political party. Instead of dismissing denialism as collective ignorance, our guest is going to make sure we treat it seriously as a phenomenon that works. To do this, though, we must first recognize that all knowledge is connected. We've been taught that if the right evidence comes along, we should reject our beliefs no matter what. Our models of logic, reasoning, science, and political argument insist that a reasonable person should be able to compartmentalize their doubt. But people aren't built this way. For example, In the 1960s, many Americans lost faith in the Vietnam War, which caused them to lose trust in government itself, in segregation, and even formal clothing. The people who wanted to hold on to these things because they were used to them had to accept Vietnam as moral in order to do this. This is why pro Vietnam conservatives are the same people who attacked the Beatles for having long hair. Doubts are like dominoes. Once we knock down the first one, all the others are likely to follow. Many of today's Catholics learned of the church's child abuse and renegotiated their trust in authority and expertise in general. A lot of children who discover a parent's infidelity can no longer accept that their parents love them. When North Dakota couldn't protect us from the pandemic, I found myself wondering if it could stop gas pumps from overcharging my credit card. Maybe this sounds silly, but it's what happened. Denialism isn't really about knowledge. It's about belief, which is something very different. It involves questioning our personal commitments, which in turn undermines our self confidence and trust in ourselves. Am I a reliable arbiter of true and false, of right and wrong? If so, why? What makes me so special? Why is my common sense superior to your common sense? To explore denialism is to explore identity. It is to ask who we are and what we are capable of becoming. It is to consider not whether we live on the moon, but whether believing that we don't is rational. If we let go of that, what do we have left? And now our guest. Adrian Bardon is professor of philosophy at Wake Forest University. He's the author of two books. The one we'll be talking about today is The Truth About Denial, published by Oxford University Press. Adrian, welcome to Why.
Hey, thanks for having me.
To our listeners, if you'd like to participate, please share your favorite moments from the show and tag us on social networks. Our handle is always at Why Radio Show, WHY Radio Show. Rate us on iTunes, Spotify, or your preferred podcast platform so that others can find the show. And listen to all 17 seasons worth of the episode for free, as well as our sister show, Philosophical Currents, at our website, whyradioshow.org. And as always, the show can only happen with your support. We exist solely on listener contributions. So click donate in the upper right-hand corner of our website to make your tax-deductible donation through the University of North Dakota Alumni Foundation portal. So Adrian, I guess I want to start by pointing out that you've written a book about denialism, but not about being wrong. Why doesn't our conversation just boil down to who is right and who isn't?
Well, Jack, in my youth, I naively thought that people would and could make better decisions and be better citizens if they just had access to sufficient knowledge and information. But the more I looked into that question, spurred initially by the whole phenomenon of climate science denial, the more I came to understand that belief doesn't really work that way, as you just mentioned, that cognition and evidence assessment is, especially in ideological contexts, is just suffused with emotion, with affect and implicit motives. And in any event, what most people believe isn't actually based on their own work, that is to say, their own information processing, because most of what people believe, for the most part, is based on trust and on testimony, rather than looking at the evidence themselves and crunching it like an information processor. So a proper understanding of belief and all the social consequences of people believing things that are, quote, wrong requires looking not at logic and rationality, whatever that is, but rather at psychology and emotion and the impacts of that on belief.
And this isn't just complex ideas, right? I've never been to Zimbabwe, and I trust the people who have and the map makers that it exists. I know nothing about the ocean, but scientists tell me that it has a floor, that it doesn't go on forever, and I believe them, right? So it's not just these complex theories that we have to rely on others for. It's pretty much most of our knowledge. Am I right?
The vast majority of our knowledge, for sure, is based on testimony, essentially. There's a few things I can work out for myself, like 2 + 2 = 4, which is about the limit of my own math capabilities. And there's some things that I've experienced myself, of course, what's right in front of me, like that I have 2 hands, for example. The existence of the planet Neptune, I've never actually seen it with my own eyes. You need some telescope and some know-how to figure out how to locate that. What's the atomic weight of hydrogen? I just read that out of the book and I go, okay, that's the atomic weight of hydrogen. And it's not a big deal. If you were to somehow make a list of all the things that we believe to be true, probably impossible, but you come up with millions and millions of individual fact nuggets. I think the vast, vast, vast majority would be essentially the product of trust in someone's testimony.
Does this mean that the history of epistemology is all misguided? I've used the word epistemology on the show many times. It's the study of the nature and limits of knowledge. It asks what we can know and how we know it. And I was talking about it in the monologue. And philosophers have been obsessed with asking how people can evaluate their own knowledge and where logical argument is and the structure of the mind. Does the fact that we rely on authorities, on trusted people, undermine that discussion?
Well, to some extent, it depends what you're trying to do and what you're trying to explain. I'm very interested in epistemology myself, but a lot of the study of if you're talking about the technical study of what constitutes justified true belief or what's being warranted in your beliefs, a lot of that, most of that, when you're actually doing the academic study thereof, is pretty technical stuff that is not directly pertinent to how people actually function in the world most of the time. Because what really happens against Descartes, who viewed knowledge as something that sort of originated out of this individual interiority, really knowledge is, for the most part, socially constructed. And belief happens in a social context and is profoundly, furthermore, influenced by individual and group psychology. So if you really want to study knowledge in practical terms, in terms of what's socially important, you have to look at psychology and sociology and the social sciences generally to really understand what's actually going on.
This is one of the fascinating threads that runs through the book. You cite just tons and tons of evidence of empirical studies, of social psychology, of neuroscience, of everything. And I found myself wondering, where is the line between psychology and philosophy? Why is denialism a philosophical subject along with, say, a social psychological subject?
In the broad sense, everything is a philosophical subject. It's a matter of approach and asking big questions and engaging with concepts discursively. And they're not so much separate fields as you can do a philosophical thinking about social psychology. So social psychology is what I point when I was thinking of I started again thinking about climate science denial. And then this eventually blossomed into thinking about denialism much more broadly and in many, many, many different areas of human life. But what I went to I looked at the epistemology literature and then I looked at the social science literature and I realized the social science literature was where to find the actual facts. And then we ask philosophical questions about what to make of these facts and how we should conceptualize belief in a social context in light of those facts. Philosophy is not a body of knowledge. In my view, philosophy is legitimate, is effective when it works very closely hand in hand with the sciences. We get the facts from the sciences, and then we ask interesting questions that create ongoing discussions about the individual and society based on those facts.
This is a discussion that actually feeds into your main themes because, of course, we are educated in a system that creates silos, that sociology is different than psychology, which is different than biology, and we have majors in college. The first major actually only appeared in Harvard around the turn of the 20th century. And before then, knowledge was divided up into three categories: natural philosophy, moral philosophy, and logic. And then they fiddled around with this. You said knowledge is socially constructed. What does that mean? And how is social construction sort of a mixture of all of these different disciplines and fields?
Okay, well, so starting with the discipline issue, I was just interested, first of all, in a certain phenomenon, which is that evidently people are capable of rejecting scientific consensus, even when accepting that consensus would be in their long-term best interest. And so I just thought to myself as a philosopher, okay, what can I do with this? And again, I looked at the the technical work in epistemology, and then I looked at the social sciences. And in this case, you mentioned siloed disciplines. This is actually a very interdisciplinary study in the context of social science, because I started looking at social psychology in particular, but also in political science departments, you have a subfield called political psychology. And then you have communications departments working on messaging and social context for belief formation via media and communication. Yeah, so sociology, poli sci, communications, social psychology, even neuroscience, there was a lot of interdisciplinarity there. So I thought as a philosopher, I'm very interested in the social phenomenon, and I'm alarmed by the social phenomenon. And so what can I do? And so I thought, well, what I can do is I can go read a lot of social science and kind of digest that and bring that over to the world of philosophy and then communicate that to people who are interested in philosophy and link up the social science on denialism with philosophical questions about knowledge and belief and the social construction of knowledge, which is what you asked me about. So you asked about the social construction of knowledge. So yeah, what does that mean? It doesn't mean that our reality itself is a mere construct, like you mentioned the matrix or something like that. But knowledge happens within a worldview. People have like sort of large schemas for understanding the world around them. To give you one example, let me give you an example instead of just talking in the abstract. If you're a very religious person, you've got this underlying scheme for understanding phenomena in society, like, well, it's all God, part of God's plan. Okay. So there's an ideological worldview that's going to color what you believe about the world and how the world works and what people should do and how people behave and what they should believe. And so all of your beliefs are then informed by that ideological worldview. Now, ideological worldviews in turn are definitely socially constructed. Ideological worldviews are formed like in group settings and within social identities. And so if our knowledge compendium is fundamentally colored by our ideological worldview, and those worldviews are themselves social products, that's what I mean by the social construction of knowledge.
So we think of marriage as real. We take two people and we bring them before an authority, and that authority does what's called a performative utterance. They say, poof, you're married, and then poof, we treat the marriage as real. And we can explain this in terms of contracts, in terms of sort of Plato's soulmates, in terms of a covenant with God, but it's still just we decided this is real because we said so. And we have the same thing in terms of, let's say, property lines, right? We've declared property lines, and fourth grade level reading is the same sort of thing. And so this notion of social construction informs our everyday life to such an extent that the things that we think are real are actually created, constructed, built by our society. And so I guess the question I have is, when you say knowledge is socially constructed, do you mean what we think we know is evaluated by the society? Or are you saying that the objects of knowledge, the things that we concern ourselves with, is the stuff that's socially constructed? And what I mean by that is are we saying that right and wrong is approved of or disapproved of by the society? Or are we saying the very things that we ask whether they're right or wrong are themselves the product of social interaction and decision and history and all that sort of stuff?
Well, indeed. So there are two different issues there. The concept of marriage, that's a really nice example. Marriage is obviously a social construct. It's a tradition. It's and how it's defined is something that's the product of culture and society. What I'm more interested in is probably the other side. Again, I started thinking about climate, and I started thinking about vaccine denialism and nuclear power and gun safety. And these are things that are amenable to empirical study, and directly so, right? Like either putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere results in the greenhouse effect or it doesn't. Like that's not a social construct. That's a, boy, it's getting hot in here situation. And there's a concrete reason for why it's getting hot in here. But why is there this huge gap between the overwhelming scientific consensus on something like that and what people believe? So what interests me and what is so murky and difficult and complex and contradictory is what happens in your mind when you're trying to assess a scientific consensus on reality itself, right? And on non-socially constructed issues like the actual chemical makeup of the atmosphere, and how that assessment is affected by people's, biases and motives and their social context.
So I'm going to ask you a very specific question when we get back from the break, which is about the inconsistency of people. And that will allow us to explore the idea of denialism very specifically and the stuff that you're talking about right now. But until then, we're going to take a break. You're listening to Adrian Bardon and Jack Russell Weinstein on Why Philosophical Discussions About Everyday Life. We'll be back right after this.
The Institute for Philosophy and Public Life bridges the gap between academic philosophy and the general public. Its mission is to cultivate discussion between philosophy professionals and others who have an interest in the subject, regardless of experience or credentials. Visit us on the web at philosophyandpubliclife.org. The Institute for Philosophy and Public Life, because there is no ivory tower.
You're back with Why Philosophical Discussions About Everyday Life. I'm your host, Jack Russell Weinstein. We're talking with Adrian Bardon about denialism, about the experience of individuals and groups denying things that we can, for example, prove are scientifically, empirically true. And so I promised I'd start with an example and a puzzle. And Adrian, you have a person who denies the expertise of scientists, right? Maybe they deny climate change. Maybe they're in some other conversation. They're knee deep in the conversation we're having right now in our society. Experts are liberal crazies. We can't rely on this. And yet, when they want heart surgery, they go to experts. They deny science on one hand and then insist upon science in surgery and in repairing their car with the internal combustion engine. Traditionally, the approach is to say these people are just irrational, they're inconsistent, they're stupid, that whatever. But your book is all about how complicated things are in this experience and what's going on. So how do we start from this puzzle of a person denying expertise in one sphere and desperately relying upon expertise in another?
Well, that's a very big question. The fact is, human beings are fantastic at being inconsistent in that way. And in a way, it's kind of our superpower. So, a prevailing view about cognition, and much more popular in the last couple decades, is there's something called the argumentative theory of reasoning. And basically, what that means is that our cognition is not thought of as having evolved primarily with the aim at getting at the truth of things, but rather for social success. When you look back to our evolutionary history, go back hundreds of thousands of years, we, throughout the vast majority of our history, I hope for Homo sapiens, I'm talking about by us, Homo sapiens, and our other ancestors, we're existing in small little kinship groups or tribal groups and surviving that way. And we developed over time big brains and language use. We're not the strongest, the toughest creatures out there, but what human beings are extremely good at, and what is our evolutionary niche, is social cooperation. We can talk to each other and make plans and cooperate, and that's what's given us our advantage and made us the dominant species on the planet. So it's in that context that our cognition evolved, our cognition itself. So in that context, what is to your advantage? Is it to always know the truth of things and to always be questioning the truth of things? Or is it more about social cohesion and persuasion and cooperation? It's the latter, according to the argumentative theory of reasoning, that if you're in this small social tribal context, there's a few things you need to know the truth about, like can I eat these berries or not, or are they poisonous? Right. Then accuracy is important. But with regard to like big issues, like what God to worship, accuracy is not it can be counterproductive. If everyone's worshiping Poseidon and you're the person who comes and goes, I'd like to see the evidence for this Poseidon guy, right? Well, what's going to happen to you? Social ostracism, execution, what have you, right? You're going to integrate into your group, and you're as an individual, you're going to succeed by adopting that worldview. Now, the thing about worldviews is that they only work socially if they're hard to fake, to borrow a phrase from economist Robert Frank. Worldviews have to be hard to fake. That is to say that it's people are very good at picking up on whether you genuinely believe something or not. So the capacity to adapt your worldview to the social group around you is actually a key adaptive evolutionary advantage. And so that sort of suffuses through our whole cognitive system. All of our information processing is based on a foundation of reasoning for its social impact and for social assimilation rather than for accuracy. And so what our superpower turns into, I said this is like our superpower. Our denialism is like a superpower because denialism is our execution of, and I'm going to introduce a little phrase of my own, doxastic flexibility. That has to do with like our attitudes towards factual statements. We're actually capable essentially of executing biases and deceiving ourselves into believing things that we wouldn't ordinarily believe if we were just attending to the evidence. And that sounds like a flaw in modern society. But again, from an evolutionary perspective, it's actually a feature rather than a bug. So that's where it comes from that we can live in a society where paying attention to evidence is often very important, but we sort of systematically can deny a scientific consensus on one thing, like vaccines, while without questioning a scientific consensus on something else, like antibiotics.
That phrase that you just used comes from the Greek doxa, which is a word that means common belief. And we see this all the time in the debate about canceling people, that for celebrities or for people who need jobs, it's probably better to go with the flow than insult all of the people who will stop watching you, paying you, working with you, or what have you. So this is really interesting. I mean, this is a really important shift because so often we think about evolution aligned with scientific progress, that we are the animal who knows, to sort of borrow an idea from Aristotle, that the more advanced we get, the more precise our knowledge is. But what you're suggesting is that evolution actually is much more concerned with whether or not we're going to be killed, whether or not we have people to build our houses with us. And so in the long run, believing or not believing in God is a heck of a lot less important than whether or not someone is going to hit you over the head or steal your stuff or even let you in the community at all. Does that change, again, this traditional notion that human beings are designed for knowledge, that human beings, that our natural curiosity moves us forward? What does this say about the species-wise importance of conformity, of being just like everyone else, as opposed to finding out the truth of the matter?
Well, if you're trying to understand human behavior in a social context, cognition serves multiple functions. Like you have a bunch of apps on your phone, like your phone does a lot of things. But to oversimplify and be reductive, your best shot at understanding why people behave the way they do and believe what they do in a social context is to think of us not as designed for knowledge, but as designed for communication and integration and cooperation and persuasion. Looking at it just that way is going to oversimplify the situation, but that will get you the furthest in terms of understanding human social phenomena.
I think it's important at this point. We've talked about climate denial a little bit, although we haven't pulled that thread, and we've referred to religion, although we haven't really pulled that thread. That you have this whole discussion about what gets called the asymmetry thesis, which is,
Mm.
do conservatives disbelieve more than liberals, et cetera? And you quote someone in the book. You quote journalist Michael Schulson with this. I love this quote. He says, "Whole Foods is America's temple of pseudoscience."
Mm.
That the grocery store Whole Foods is the epicenter of pseudoscience. Can you explain what that means and why this helps us understand that this is a community-wide, species-wide issue, not just one group of people who happen to be religious fundamentalists or what have you?
Well, you're referring to what is like the big, deep underlying controversy across multiple disciplines in social science with regard to denialism. And that essentially has to do with whether there's something inherent to conservatism or the conservative personality that makes you more prone to denialism or not. And this is a ranging and contentious matter. So there's basically two schools of thought. One is that yes, there's an issue there with conservatives, and especially, by the way, white male conservatives, because of the bias for the status quo, which is by definition what it is to be conservative, is to be comfortable with existing cultural, social, economic hierarchies and to want to preserve existing structures and the way that they operate. That's what conservatism means, that you think that it's a good thing to conserve those structures. So the thing about science is that it tends to upend our ways of thinking about in the modern context. And so the theory is, and especially again, white male conservatives are really invested in the social status quo. The Western world was, constructed by and men in particular, and we see it between that group and what we call political conservatives today, that there would be this instinctive implicit bias in favor of conserving those structures and therefore opposing any scientific developments that would tend to upend those structures. And once again, going back to climate change, the thing about climate change is if you're going to address it, you have to do a big society-wide upheaval in terms of how we produce and consume things. And that's a humongous potential blow to the status quo. On the asymmetry thesis, you say A, that conservatives are more prone to science denial. That's one claim, which is debated. And then B is what we call the intrinsic thesis, which is that the reason for that is that there's something intrinsic to conservative philosophy and or personality that makes those people specifically more prone. So that's a long way of getting back around to whole food. So what you mentioned is someone trying to make the counterpoint and saying that, well, actually, if you look at leftists, liberals, progressives, whatever you want to call them, you can see them specifically engaging in some really bizarre behaviors. So, for example, buying homeopathic medicine at Whole Foods. If you look into homeopathic medicine, they're these little vials of water that you buy at Whole Foods, and last I checked, they're still on sale there. It's the most ridiculous thing, frankly, on the face of the earth. And there's all kinds of other stuff especially in the supplements aisle at Whole Foods. I haven't been there in a while, but there's like all these probiotics and weird supplements and things that have no real scientific basis whatsoever. So that quote you read is someone making the point that leftists don't appear to have this sort of unique connection to the truth of the matter with regard to their own issues. Other people have mentioned political leftists having some wild views about the history of nuclear power safety. You ask people, how many people have actually died in nuclear power plant accidents? And the number you get out of that, and I always like to quantify things. The number you get from a leftist is very reliably so much higher than what you get from a conservative, and furthermore, way out of way out of touch with reality. Actually, very, very few people, including Chernobyl, have actually died from nuclear power plant accidents. You get wild overestimations on that point, for example, right? And why is that? Being opposed to nuclear power conforms with something that is obviously attractive to the political left. Let me go back to the 1960s. So in the 60s, the political left was considered the anti-science side. Like you had Rachel Carson, Salad Spring, talking about the impacts of DDT, the anti-nuclear power, anti-nuclear weapons. anti-industrialization, anti-pollution, anti-plastics. This was the 60s. We had this brave new world where, in the U.S. context, for sure, you had this massive economic expansion that was fundamentally the outgrowth of industrialization and globalization. And the left was harping on the negative impacts. The left would have the reputation at the time as being less trusting of the scientific of the scientists in the scientific community when you do polling on that. So this started changing in the 70s, and you can see this in the General Social Science Survey, which is a very useful instrument that they started up in the early 70s, asking a lot of people a variety of relevant questions on their attitudes. And it's in the 70s you started to see the political left gaining year after year more and more trust in science, and you started to see on the flip side conservatives losing trust in science and scientists. And the difference between the 1970s and today is quite stark in terms of the way that has flipped. So what happened is the most salient science in the 1950s and 60s was we now call production science, the science of industrial production. With all the pollution and species extinction, all the things and the negative impacts of production, you started to have a new form of science, which became much more salient in the public eye, and that's what we now call impact science, which is the science of the impacts of production. That kind of science appeals to the left more, whereas production science appeals to the right. And that, if you just look at it, step back and look at the big picture, that explains a heck of a lot in terms of people's attitudes towards science and how that correlates with their political leanings.
This is a really important distinction that you talk about a bunch in the book, that to sort of explain those two categories, production science is a science that produces things, that makes motors, that builds things, that creates the chemicals that allow us to grow things more efficiently, and the combines and all that kind of stuff. And conservatives in particular are very, very supportive of this. But then there's impact science, which describes something a little harder to feel or quantify, which is this technology is going to have this impact on the world. This fossil fuels will have this impact on climate change. And so when we talk about science, in order to make sense of these contradictions, we have to divide science up into something that itself becomes partisan. I'll use the word partisan. You make the point, though, in the book that saying science denial is actually redundant, that denial is itself scientific. What did you mean by that?
Well, if you just boil it all down to, okay, we're doing information and evidence processing on some level when we do cognition. The question is what the result of that processing is deeply affected by your motives, your emotions, by your ideological worldviews. At root, now there's science at deep heart of it. There's just the part of science where you're just doing data collection, right? What you choose to investigate in science is very value laden, as philosopher Heather Douglas, for example, has written about. And how you assess evidence, the famous phenomenon known as confirmation bias, is absolutely endemic to human beings. That we will focus on the evidence for positive evidence for what was already our preconceived notion about how the world works, or what we want to believe about how the world works, and we will dismiss evidence that undermines our worldview that we're emotionally attached to. And this phenomenon is almost impossible to separate from cognition. What what science does when science is working well, when you're following the scientific process properly, let me put quotes around that. Science is essentially constructed to take into account and to eliminate biases. You form hypotheses, you have to collect evidence, you have to show people what your methods are, you have to show people what data you collected, was the data collected properly. Then your work goes through peer review by other experts. It goes through criticism, and then other studies are done. People try to replicate your work, or people come up with other theories, and they try to prove those theories. Through that process, the idea is that we sort of cancel out the biases, kind of like noise canceling headphones. It's like creates this reverse wave that cancels out the biases that just sort of naturally come with our cognitive processes and our evidence assessment processes. And it produces, therefore, also, we talked about how most of our beliefs are based on trust and testimony. It produces a class of experts that, again, under ideal conditions, those experts working within a long established scientific consensus are supposed to be both trustworthy and trusted when it comes to, big issues about how nature works that no individual really grasps and most individuals have no direct evidence for whatsoever. So there's science, and then there's how we deal with evidence as individuals and as groups. And the hope is that the scientific process, again, it can never be like rise above our biases, but the hope is that the process itself cancels it out.
You started off when we first started talking about how philosophy can take any subject and look at it. And that's because, in part, not completely, but in part, philosophy is a method and science is a method too. And science is a way, as you're saying, of controlling for biases, of making things reproducible, of looking for the falsity of things, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the mistakes that people make, and this is one of the reasons why I brought up your point in the book, is that we tend to think of science as having reasons and evidence and argument, and denial as being intuition and disconnected. But this actually misrepresents what denialism is, that denialism uses science in a certain way to argue for the position and has its own reasons and has its own justifications, right? So, could you talk a little bit about the way that denialism itself relies on the very sorts of things that we assume should undermine it?
What people do when they're trying to instinctively and intuitively defend their worldview and their way of life against a scientific consensus is they do motivated reasoning and rationalization. This also involves the confirmation bias as part of this process. But what some knowledge of science and some expertise does for you is that it gives you ammunition for rationalizing your position. And we saw it, I'm sure you saw in the book, we look at conservatives and political liberals. We look at their grasp of climate science literacy. And political conservatives are more likely to deny climate science. But that doesn't mean they're bad at science. The conservatives' grasp of climate science just tracks right along with leftists. Some of them are bad at it, and some of them know more. But it turns out the more you know about climate science, if you're a political conservative, the more likely you are to deny the scientific consensus. And what's happening there, and we see this in many, many other areas of human thought and in denialism, is that the more you know, the more you're able to draw on concepts and information in order to defend the position that you're already committed to ideologically, right? As Jonathan Haidt, the psychologist, likes to say, when we're reasoning, we're not so much being scientists as being lawyers. It's more like we advocate for our own worldview implicitly, unconsciously, and it colors our assessment of evidence. But in a way, I think this is what you're referring to is the more knowledge we have, is the better we get at that, and the more we can convince ourselves that we're right. When you go on a message board or you read someone who's just denying anthropogenic climate change, they'll talk about stuff like sunspots or Milankovitch cycles or wobbles in the Earth's orbit or the tilt of the Earth or changes in the phases of the sun, right? And they'll say, "Oh, well, that's really what's going on. It's not fossil fuels, right?" Well, now that's wrong, but you have to have some education and scientific literacy to know what Milankovitch cycles are. And it gives you this tool first for convincing yourself that you're right and that what you wanted to believe and what's comfortable for you to believe must be correct. Then that turns into the social phenomenon of you now publicly deny and create whole ideologies around denying the scientific consensus, drawing on your limited scientific knowledge or your acquaintance with certain scientific concepts in order to maintain the social and economic structures that you were already motivated to maintain.
It popped into my head this video that a family friend sent to me with a couple Orthodox Jews arguing for the historical truth of the Hebrew Scriptures. And these guys were smart. These guys obviously knew the scriptures backwards and forwards in Hebrew and English and made all of these connections that sounded really compelling and tremendous inferences. And I only got through half of the video for my friend because he wanted me to debunk it, not because I got distracted, but because it took me so long to get through the first half hour that I didn't have time to get through the second half hour. It took me probably 5 times as long to watch and attend to the video as it did for them to record it. And this is the kind of thing that you're talking about, that there's so much knowledge and so much detail that in order to debunk these connections, you have to know that their definition of X or Y or their account of sunspots or what have you, or the trajectory of bullets in the Kennedy assassination, they're just misrepresenting it a little bit, or they're making connections that aren't there. So that's the first problem. And the second problem is you referred to it as I think the backfire effect, right? That when you challenge these ideas, it makes someone dig in. Can you talk a little bit about the backfire effect and how challenging the veracity of denialism actually promotes denialism in a certain way rather than undermines it?
The backfire effect comes out of social psychology and communications. That's in the communication world, it's actually called the boomerang effect, but it's kind of a very similar concept based on similar kinds of phenomena. It's a little bit controversial whether or not how robust the backfire effect is. What people were finding, we're talking about 15 years ago. It was about when you had this big explosion in the social science on denialism. And people were finding in focus groups, they would divide people into political liberals and conservatives again. And what they were finding that when they would have the group take a position on some issue, gun safety or nuclear power or climate change or whether there's WMDs in Iraq, that was a famous one. Or sorry, after the Iraq war, like did they or did they not find WMDs in Iraq? Now that's definitely no, right? But it's more likely to a political conservative, you ask them that question, they're more likely to say yes. They at the time they would say yes, there were WMDs in Iraq. That's objectively just not the case. And then they presented these groups on these various subjects with contrary evidence, including testimony from their own political leaders that debunked it. And some findings which showed that certain people, again, going back to the asymmetry thesis, right, particularly political conservatives, seem to increase their confidence in their incorrect beliefs after they were presented with the refuting evidence. When people tried to replicate this effect, it was mixed results. So the backfire effect is not very consistent. But it is true that people do tend to dig in, of course, because they feel attacked. The thing about human knowledge in ideological context is that it's an outgrowth of your identity. And going back to our issue about knowledge being socially constructed, right? I'm a Christian. I'm not, but I'll just for sake of argument. I'm a Texan. I'm a Christian. I'm an environmentalist. I'm a member of the Boy Scouts. These are when people ask me about myself, who are you? I tell them, well, I'm married. I'm the father of this many people, and I belong to this group. I belong to this club. I belong to this political party. These are aspects of social identity because the way we define ourselves is in terms of our relationships, in terms of our group relationships. And so people will instinctively defend their identities because that's what you're emotionally attached to. It's like literally how you define yourself is in terms of these social connections. So when you're presented with information that threatens your identity, your response, and even on the level on the level of what's happening in your brain, right? Neuroscientists have looked at live on fMRIs and looked at what's happening in your brain when someone is giving you facts that challenge your social identity or your beliefs or your ideological worldview. And people react to that contrary evidence with their essentially with their emotional brain, right? What happens is you get this effectively a kind of fight or flight response to unwelcome information. This is very instinctive, it's very natural, and it's absolutely pervasive. So the expectation almost is that people are going to dig in like that when they're presented with evidence that's threatening and on some level to their ideological worldview, which in turn is threatening to their identity itself, right? So, in other words, unwelcome information feels like a personal attack. And what happens when we feel personally attacked is we fight back. And so that's what whether you call it the backfire effect or not, or whether you think it's, specific to conservatives or not, that's definitely a fundamental aspect of human nature. So it's not surprising to find that. And it gets even worse in group settings because something happens called group polarization. That's a very well recognized and accepted phenomenon in the social sciences, which is that when you get a bunch of like-minded people together and they only communicate with each other in some context, they actually get more polarized on the issue. That's to say, their confidence in their worldview gets stronger and they get more and more hostile to contrary evidence in the group context. Where that just goes hand in hand with what we were calling the, social construction of knowledge.
It's very interesting to look at the history of the debate about whether Barack Obama was born in the United States, which he was, which is that the more people talked about it and the more people showed his birth certificate and all these other things, the more Republicans disbelieved it. That the conversation debunking it actually increased the amount of people who believed the falsity. And this really undermines this idea that a lot of democratic countries ascribe to, which is the marketplace of ideas, that good ideas will outpace bad ideas, that eventually the truth will win out. And that part of what you're reporting is that that's just not true for all of these psychosocial reasons. In a minute, I want to ask you about this connection between reason and emotion because we've been circling around it. But I want to talk about identity for a couple minutes. I'm thinking about this group identification, and the fact of the matter is that in the world right now, it is almost entirely impossible to identify yourself as liberal or a leftist without being aggressively anti-Israel. You are not accepted in left circles unless you hold that position. And in the United States, particularly for very, very right-wing circles, you cannot be anti-guns, you can't be anti-pro-abortion, that you really get rejected aggressively. And the question that I have is it that people want to be, let's say, identified as leftist? People want to be thought of as a leftist, therefore they will hold on to the position and believe something and learn to believe something just to have that label? Or is it that their identity, that what it's revealing is that there is some sort of deep consistency that they're unaware of in their morality? I mean, the question I'm asking in essence is, are you a liberal who holds these beliefs, or are you someone who develops those beliefs because you want people to think of yourself as a liberal or a Christian or what have you? What's the role of self-identification and labeling, in-group labeling? How much does that inform what people think they have to believe in order to be called something?
In my view, and it sounds cynical and hyperbolic, and it is because, as I said, cognition does a lot of things. There are a lot of apps for cognition. But I think to take a shortcut and to oversimplify it a little bit, I mean, people want to have a social group. People want to feel like they're part of something. The need for belongingness and inclusion is maybe our deepest emotion of all. But now, once you have, thanks to your environment, thanks to the people you naturally hang out with, partly maybe in response to your personality, and your personal experiences, you wind up with groups that you identify with, right? Including these ideological groups, a political ideology, religious ideology. And we have a powerful, powerful motive to want to kind of maintain and strengthen those bonds and that sense of belonging and sense of inclusion. So it's a very natural outgrowth of that these ideological groups are going to like form doctrines like this, it's right to believe this and it's not right to believe that, right? Which is how you get this sort of, I think you're referring to sort of this sort of cancel culture, right? Or exclusion from the group if you have any kind of like views that are not doctrinal to that group, which is certainly a phenomenon. There's a really big question behind this, by the way, as to how much of what you're describing, where like you're not allowed to, or the perception at least is you can't be a leftist and be pro-Israel. How much of that perception is like a media product or not? And this is where we need communication department. They studied the effects of how people work inside media and how and what effect it has on people's attitudes and beliefs.
Yeah, I want to interrupt a second. I'm sorry because this is really interesting because I have the joint experience of my last book being about Israel and Palestine, and a huge amount of my life is around college students. And college
Mhm.
students
Yeah.
who identify themselves as leftist will use the term genocide and be aggressively pro Gaza and having no sense of the history at all. And my book has a lot more moral ambiguity than that. It doesn't fit in either. And what my experience has been with the college students and actually with many friends is the friends who are on the left and might disagree with some of my conclusions, they read the book and they never mentioned it to me. They never talked about it again. They didn't put it on the table, that they just couldn't engage with me on the issues at all. And that's now there's all sorts of equivalent things on the right, but that's the kind of pressure that you feel in groups, especially because when you're younger, you very often form your moral opinions based on peer pressure, based on your upbringing. You as I say in the book, you have a moral opinion before you have the knowledge to back up the moral opinion. I want to pull this thread a little more because the other thing that popped into my head while you were saying this is Samuel L. Jackson's line in Pulp Fiction, "My girlfriend's a vegetarian, I guess that makes me a vegetarian too." Right? This deep need for connection overriding many, if not all, of the other
Mhm.
factors. And so I guess the thing I want to ask is, does that mean that emotion is in charge of reason? David Hume famously wrote that reason is the slave
Mhm.
of the passions, right? And when you use the phrase motivating rationality, a motivated reasoning, the
Yeah.
idea behind that is that you're making an argument motivated towards a particular point of view, and it's not the same thing as begging the question, but that you're looking at the world with a particular motivation, a particular attitude, and a particular way of framing things. And so, are we ultimately saying that part of the issue with denialism is that logic and reasoning is ultimately subordinate to emotions, to passions, to the instinctual and evolutionary need for belonging, and therefore we have just been ascribing just way too much power to logic and reason to change people's minds?
So ambiguity is uncomfortable, maybe more so for some people than others, but people generally want to feel kind of a sense of closure and like have a grasp of what's going on around them. And on my view, one of the main reasons why ambiguity is uncomfortable is you don't know where you belong when you don't know what to believe. And that's what for you, they give you this sense of security and control, which is just again just a fundamental human motive is to feel that that sense of belonging makes you feel safe. What joins people together in social groups is their belief system. So the notion of embracing ambiguity and disagreeing with your social group on issues X and Y while agreeing them on, issue Z kind of fundamentally runs counter to that. Is reason, suffused with emotion? Absolutely. Studies, I should say, done by associated with the political scientist Tabor and Lodge. A really great book out there, Rationalizing Voter, which everyone should check out. Simple, and again, I like to quantify things, right? They would flash people a picture of, be the 2000s of, Kerry and when they were running against each other. And, they would ask different groups of people, like, a different question, and they were asked to press a button as quickly as they can, and one question was, "Do you like or dislike this person?" And it would take about half a second, about 700 milliseconds, as a matter of fact, for folks to respond whether they like or dislike that person. But they would ask, other people, okay, is this a Republican or a Democrat? And it takes significantly longer to do any kind of actual information processing on what you're looking at than to have that emotional reaction. So as these researchers put it, precedes and contextualizes cognition, right? Cognition, your emotional responses objectively just happen faster than your information processing does. So the information processing is always happening within an emotional context. Now, that doesn't stop you from being right in your conclusions or even basing your conclusions properly on the evidence. But there's definitely the context is always emotional, right? There's no like non-emotional reasoning. I'm sure you're familiar with the neuroscientist Antonio Damasio, who looked at people who had suffered some brain damage that had severely limited their ability to basically feel emotions or have emotional responses. And he found them to be cognitively incompetent. Like they were not able to make decisions or make either make good decisions or even to make any decisions at all without having any kind of emotional response to the situation. So, yeah, objectively, you can demonstrate that all cognition happens within an emotional context, and your thought processes are going to be partly in service to your motives, right? Again, the whole point of the scientific process is that we're looking at evidence in a larger context, which is kind of self critical. And you're looking for people are trying to disconfirm your beliefs or refute your findings and replicate them if they can. If they can't replicate them, then they're not legitimate findings. And everyone brings their own biases to the table, but it's a bit of a competitive environment. And the idea is that the result of that whole process is that we sort of cancel out the biases, but the biases are always present.
We're just about out of time, but that leads to the last question that I want to ask, which is given that these biases, this denialism, that this group identity is endemic to the human experience,
Mm.
does that mean that the republic is doomed? Does that mean that is there anything that we can do about this to promote a more honest, objective, maybe truthful is the better word, dialogue between the disagreeing parties? Because at no point, and I think this is really important to emphasize, at no point have you denied that truth exists. At no point have you suggested that you can't look at the evidence and find an objective reason answer to many of these questions, especially you keep coming back to climate change, which is empirically verifiable. Is this just the way it's going to be? And we got to figure out how to get through it using advanced digital techniques and spin and messaging, and elections are always going to be about the 7 people who haven't made decisions yet? Or is there some way to create a dialogue that is more rooted in truth and that allows people to step outside of their in group to meet one another in a more open-minded way?
I was kind of hoping we'd run out of time before you asked me to actually solve this problem.
And the answer can be you don't know. That's
It's very
perfectly fine.
what I can do is kind of talk about what the best practices are. So saying that these are the best practices doesn't mean it's going to work. It's just these are the best tools we have at our disposal, knowing what we know. Based on reading a lot of social science and reading a lot of studies on people on debunking misinformation and disinformation, which by the way is a major issue that we haven't discussed. And there's big questions about what the role of media and social media have to play here. I think it's pretty clear that, in my view at least, that things are not heading in the right direction when it comes to tackling major social and economic issues where we need collective action to tackle these issues. And that means we need a shared reality, a shared worldview where we all agree that, yes, we shouldn't, if you put this stuff into the atmosphere, we're going to have a problem. And so, but we don't have that shared reality. And it seems like we're almost sliding in the wrong direction. Our vaccine's safe, et cetera, et cetera. So based on what we know about belief and human behavior, what are our best practices going to be? Well, number one, I'd like to see a public education system that focuses on how science gains its authority, that focuses on scientific method and scientific curiosity, as opposed to facts and evidence, right? where people have a better understanding of how we form large theories about the world, like the germ theory of disease, which nobody questions now, but it used to be demons, right? That would be one practical thing that I would want to look at is really enhancing and improving scientific education to focus on scientific method. Some things that look like they would be helpful would be to when you're trying to communicate with people about large risk factors, climate or pandemics, is to make the context identity affirming, make sure people don't feel threatened in their identity. Maybe try to appeal to them on the level of identity. As a fellow Christian, commanded us to be good stewards of the earth. And here's a line in the Bible from that. Our climate scientists are doing God's work in helping us do our duty in this respect. So that's a context in which you're communicating with people where not only are they not, their identity is not being threatened, but it's sort of being affirmed as you're communicating with them. If you emphasize the goal of stabilizing existing systems, because the thing about these climate change and pandemics and things like that is that it represent a kind of upheaval to the system, and people feel threatened by that. Oh, I have to change the way I live. I have to wear masks. I have to drive an electric car. But if you emphasize that by addressing these issues, we get to conserve society as we know it, and you try to frame the message like that, that seems like that would hopefully be helpful in terms of, again, reducing the threat impact of information on the person you're trying to talk to. I would also, one thing that's looks a little bit promising sounds like it would be promising, is to really focus on local issues. Climate change is much too abstract in the grand scheme of things for people to be concerned with it directly. But if you talk about, we're in a farming community and we're experiencing chronic drought, right, and water shortages. Focus on that and then sort of expand out to that, to what can we do? Think locally, right, and act globally. We need to do this and this to address our local issues. And if there's a pandemic and the hospitals are overwhelmed, think about, like, here's your local hospital. Your local hospital can't take anybody right now. The ER is overflowing with people with this disease, this respiratory disease. So the vaccines and the masking are ways to address not the pandemic, but your local hospital overcrowding. Again, that sort of like reduces the threat impact of the message you're trying to deliver, while sort of like emphasizing that we're actually trying to, like, stabilize your system, preserve your way of life, as opposed to overturn it. So that's a list of related strategies that, based on what we know, would be the most promising approaches. What I can't promise is that any of that is going to function, especially in a giant media environment that really emphasizes misinformation and disinformation and media bubbles and geographic separation, the way people have basically separated themselves geographically in the US in particular, political ideology, rural areas versus cities, et cetera, et cetera. The media bubbles gives you this group polarization effect, which is very damaging.
We have to stop here, both because of time and because what you just brought up, I would love to spend 6 hours talking about. This is one of those instances where we've really scratched the surface, and that where your book is full of tremendous information and resources, and especially the incredible number of empirical, social psychological papers that you cite, that I think would be really useful for everyone to have, to see what's really going on. But unfortunately, we do have to stop, where our finger is on the pulse of something that couldn't be more important right now. So, Adrian Bardon, thank you so much for joining us on Y Radio.
Jack, thank you. It's really been fun.
I'm glad to hear that. You have been listening to Adrian Bardon and Jack Russell Weinstein on Why Philosophical Discussions About Everyday Life. I'll be back with a few more thoughts right after this.
Visit IPPL's blog, PQED, Philosophical Questions Every Day, for more philosophical discussions of everyday life. Comment on the entries and share your points of view with an ever-growing community of professional and amateur philosophers. You can access the blog and view more information on our schedule, our broadcasts, and the Y Radio store at www.philosophyinpubliclife.org.
Now, Now, why has this country that most Americans have never thought about in their entire lives become the center of our attention? Well, there's two things going on. The first is that Greenland has a huge sheet of ice over it, and underneath that are incredibly important resources, not just diamonds, but lithium and copper and oil and a whole bunch of other stuff that we want. The second is that the North Pole is a huge sheet of ice that doesn't have land underneath it. And so when everything melts because of climate change, all of these resources are going to be available and easy to get, and countries are going to be able to take their boats over the top of the globe. And suddenly, North America is exposed militarily, and Greenland is the place where we can put the military bases. Now, what did I just do? I pointed out that Donald Trump is operating on the presumption that climate change is real. And the people who believe and support Donald Trump and the overthrow of Greenland are the same people who deny climate change and that anything is going to happen. So how do those people react to what I just said? How do any of us react to this cognitive dissonance, to the fact that a lot of the things that we do and have to do, and a lot of things that the people we support do, are based on things that we say are not true, that we believe to be false, that the people who are acting on it claim is not false? This is not just a problem of knowledge. This is a problem of social acceptance. This is a problem of being part of society. And Adrian, towards the very end, uttered this sentence. He said, "You don't know where you belong if you don't know what to believe." And I think that that is the hinge of our entire discussion. And that is the core of what Adrian brings to the conversation that I wanted to talk about on the show, which is denialism, belief and disbelief, agreement and disagreement is largely about community and acceptance and belonging, and that we have treated all of these things as if they're about truth. But the human mind doesn't work that way, because humans are designed to seek community and acceptance and security before they seek objective truth. That is a profound problem. It's a problem for democracy. It's a problem for the future. It's a problem for the history of philosophy, because it forces us to reconsider what it means to be a curious, knowledgeable person with moral, scientific, political, social convictions. Puts us in a bad place, but it's on the table and we have to deal with it. With all of that said, if you've been listening to this episode on Sunday evening on Prairie Public, please know that a longer version with almost 40 more minutes of discussion is available online and as a podcast. Visit whyradioshow.org to listen or subscribe for free. For everyone else, rate us on iTunes and Spotify to help spread the word about the show. Follow us on all the usual social networks. Our handle is always @whyradioshow. WHY Radio Show, and please help us to continue broadcasting by making your tax-deductible donation to whyradioshow.org. Click donate in the upper right-hand corner to go to UND Alumni's donation portal. We exist solely on the money you provide. Thank you yet again to my guest, the folks at Prairie Public, especially our engineer, Tay Calloway. I'm Jack Russell Weinstein, signing off for Why Radio. Thanks for listening. As always, it's an honor to be with you.
Why is funded by the Institute for Philosophy and Public Life, Prairie Public Broadcasting, and the University of North Dakota's College of Arts and Sciences and Division of Research and Economic Development. The music is written and performed by Mark Weinstein and can be found on his album Louis E. Soul. For more of his music, visit jazzfluteweinstein.com or myspace.com/Mark Weinstein. Philosophy is everywhere you make it, and we hope we've inspired you with our discussion today. Remember, as we say at the Institute, there is no ivory tower.